Fantastic. So I'm going to share the source sheet for part 2 of this series on growing fruit trees in Sharon. Does Orlah apply? So last week in part 1, we discussed why does Orlah apply outside the land of Israel. And this evening, we are going to begin a more practical conversation about calculating the age of a tree for the purposes of Orlah. Okay, so the first source that is relevant to this is determining the birthday for agriculture, for plants and for trees. And we might remember from the Mishnah in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, the very first Mishnah, that there are 4 New Years. Whereas most people associate the New Year with Rosh Hashanah at the beginning of Tishrei, which what we colloquially refer to as Rosh Hashanah. There are actually 4 beginnings of the year that mark different beginnings. So we'll read together the Mishnah here and see its import. Arba'a Roshe Shanim Haim. There are 4 days that serve as a new year for different purposes. Be'echad b'Nisan Rosh Hashanah l'malachim v'leregalim. So the first of Nisan is when the year would be counted for a king. So if a king ruled for a certain amount of time, if it comes to the first of Nisan, he's already completed his first year. And also for the order of the festivals, we know that the Shalosh Regalim actually begin with Pesach, Pesach, Shavuot, and then Sukkot. That's the order for the purpose of the festivals. So that's the first Rosh Hashanah. Be'echad be'Elul, on the first of Elul, Rosh Hashanah l'ma'aser behema. When the animals were tithed, they had to determine how many animals were born in a particular year in order to know what the percentage or what the amount of the percent would yield for eating this meat in Yerushalayim. And I should note here that our current president of Young Israel of Sharon, Michael Gerber, has tried to rehabilitate Rosh Hashanah Lebehema by having a meat fest every Rosh Chodesh Elul, and it's quite an experience. So that's the second Rosh Hashanah, and there's a machloket about when exactly that is. The prevailing view is that it's the first day of Elul, but Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon say that it's the first of Tishrei. The third Rosh Hashanah, Be'echad b'Tishrei Rosh Hashanah l'Shanim. So this is the one that we're most familiar with. We count the 5, 7, 8, 2, beginning on the Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of Tishrei. But that first day of Tishrei is also a new year for Lashmitin, for the purpose of Shemitah, which is super relevant this year, which was really the reason why I was inspired to talk about Orlah, because there are so many laws of Shemitah that are only relevant for people in Israel, but Orlah is a rare exception that allows us to feel connected to the agricultural mitzvot of Israel. V'liyovlot, and the second purpose of that is for the calculation of Yovel, which is connected to Shemitah, of course. L'netia v'liyarakot. Now, I tried to underline here the word netia because that's going to be most relevant for our purposes. The word netia literally means a sapling, okay? So for the purpose of young trees and for Yerakot, in determining what year they were grown in, the beginning of Tishrei is the cutoff. And then the fourth and final Rosh Hashanah in our yearly cycle is Be'echad B'Shvat, Rosh Hashanah Le'ilan, right? Kedivrei Beit Shammai, the first of Shvat according to Beit Shammai, and the one that we are more familiar with is Tu B'Shvat, which Hillel says is going to be the real Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot. Okay, so from all the songs that we had in grade school, we know that Tu B'Shvat is the Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot. But here we see this critical distinction between Nitiya and Ilan, between a sapling and a tree. And there is a significant halachic difference between those two. So during this shir tonight, I collected some, let's just say, key terms that I thought would be useful for us in tracking the progress that we're making. So I'm going to jump down after many of our sources to the bank at the bottom of the source sheet, which has some key terms. I hope I don't make you dizzy by scrolling down, but this will just serve as a little bit of a review and to consolidate what we are covering. So key terms and concepts. So far, we saw that a nitiya, a sapling, a young tree in its years of Orlah, is called a nitiya, and the date that marks its birthday is the 1st of Tishrei, which is the new year for saplings. Okay, and then what we just saw in this Mishnah was that there's a difference between Rosh Hashanah le'ilan and le'nitiya and Rosh Hashanah le'ilanot. Okay, for saplings, it's the 1st of Tishrei, and for trees, it is the 15th of Shvat. Okay, so that's the first critical piece of information that we need for calculating the years of Orlah. We're going to look at one more piece of information, and then we're going to put it together to make a calculus. So the second piece of information is about when one transplants a tree, because in the world of fruit tree cultivation, it's very unusual to put a seed in the ground where that tree is going to be, and then for that seed to grow into a tree. What's more common is to grow the tree from a branch and to let that branch root into the ground, or to plant a sapling, to plant a seed in a pot and then to transplant it into the ground. Okay, so when it comes to fruit tree, there is oftentimes a lot of transferring that takes place. So how does that impact the count for Orlah? So the third Mishnah in Masechet Orlah, and I should note here that you can see in source 12, this Mishnah in Orlah, there is no Bavli, there is no Babylonian Talmud on Masechet, on the Mishnayot of Orlah, but there is a Talmud Yerushalmi on this, which is fascinating because it would make sense for the land-based mitzvot to have only a sort of oral tradition where they were relevant, meaning the Jerusalem Talmud, right? But Orlah is something that's not land dependent. It's not Israel dependent because it is relevant outside of Israel as well. So it's striking that there is no Talmud Bavli on the Mishnah of Orlah. So last week when we were looking at the Gemara, the Talmud on the topic, we were looking at Masechet Kiddushin and not elsewhere because there is no devoted section on Orlah. So why that is, perhaps it was people were not as knowledgeable or didn't practice fruit growing in Europe where they were living. That's all speculation, but I think it's just a fascinating observation. Okay, so back to the source here, and I'll point along with the cursor so you can follow along more easily. Ilan shena akar v'hasela imo. So if a tree was uprooted, if it was taken, let's say, from a nursery where it was growing and it was dug out of the ground, v'hasela imo. Sela, we usually think of sela to mean a rock, but here the sela is referring to the clump of dirt that forms around the root. It's like the clod. And the Bar Tanura in the source below explains that it's called a rock because it gets very hard when it clusters around the root sac. So if a tree was uprooted and the clod of earth is still around its roots, or shatfo nahar v'hasela imo, or let's say there was a flood and the tree was uprooted, but it still has the clod of earth around it, Im yachol lichyot patur, v'im lav chayav. So if the tree could survive on its own with the clod of earth that is around it, then it does not need to restart the count of Orlah. But if it would die, if it was not replanted, then it would need to start the count again for Orlah. Okay, so this is super relevant for when we buy a sapling from, let's say, Palilios or American Landscape, or any of the places that we bought fruit trees from. David, where did you buy your fruit trees from? Just out of curiosity.
Some from Palilios and then some online.
Okay.
And ones are often shipped bare root.
Right. So the ones that ship bare root clearly would not have enough soil to live off because there's barely any. And in my experience, having bought some from Palilios, when you take it out of the plastic pot, most of the soil falls off. It's not really connected to it, and it would not really suffice to keep the tree going once that dirt has fallen off for a very long time. And so the commentary on this says that it would need to live for several weeks in order for it to be considered continuing the count of Orlah that it had already started. But if it would not live for those several weeks and needs to be surrounded by more soil in order to continue living, then you have to restart the count.
Can I ask a question on those lines?
Yeah.
So occasionally if you have a tree that's not healthy, it can be recommended to dig it up and trim the roots. But in doing so, you'd really lose a lot of the soil around it. And after you trim the roots, you'd replant it again. Would that, because you're not keeping that clod of dirt there, would that then restart your Orlah count for that tree? It
would. That's what the Mishnah is referring to when it says when you uproot a tree, right? When you're doing it purposefully, whether it's for transplanting or for the sake of improving the tree, it is like you are replanting it. So let's put these two pieces of information together, and we will look at the Shulchan Aruch to connect the dots here to help us establish the criteria for, or now that we've set some of the criteria for counting, now we'll put them into practice. So the Yoredea here in source 14, I'll read in the Hebrew and translate into English, says, Anotea eitz ma'achal, so if you plant a fruit tree, monea lo gimel shanim, you need to count 3 years, me'et nitiato, from the time that it is planted. Bekol ha'perot shehiyubo, any of the fruit that is there, betoch gimel shanim, within the first 3 years, asurin bahana, is forbidden to benefit from, la'olam, forever. Ben ikar hapri, whether it's the fruit itself or any of the seeds or peels, as we learned last week. Okay, and here we're going to apply what we just learned above. Gimel shanim halalu, these 3 years that need to be counted, einam nim miyom liyom, they are not counted from day to day, meaning it's not calendar, or it's not 365 days from the anniversary of the day that you planted, which makes it the 3 years. Ella holchim behem achar shnot ha'olam. Rather, we follow the cycle, the cycles of the year. Shehu matchil mitishrei, v'im nitabra la'orla u'leravai. And we follow the 12-month year if it's not a leap year, and 13 months if it is a leap year. But we start from Tishrei, because that's the Rosh Hashanah le'nitiot. Okay. So Rosh Hashanah, what we talk about and come to shul for a long time and hear shofar on Rosh Hashanah, that's also the time that is the birthday for all saplings. Upa'amim she'eno ela shtei shanim umem daled yom. And so sometimes the Orlah is not more than 2 years and 44 days. But wait a minute, we just said above that it has to be 3 years. So how could it work out that one could start eating the fruit from a tree that was planted 2 years and 44 days ago? He's gonna, on the other hand, it could also be much more than 3 years. So where does that variance come from? Ketzad, how is this the case? So nata mikodem tet zayin ba'av. So if you planted the sapling in the ground 44 days before Rosh Hashanah, which comes out to Tu B'Av, right, the 15th of Av, Shenishar Adayin Mem Daled Yom, then there's still 44 days ad Rosh Chodesh Tishrei until Rosh Hashanah. Kevan shehigia Rosh Chodesh Tishrei alta lo shana. Once you hit Rosh Chodesh Tishrei or Rosh Hashanah, you've already put in the counter 1 year on the Orlah counter. Umaneh od shtei shanim, and then you pass through another 2 Rosh Chodesh Tishreis, which is the Rosh Hashanah, Lenetiot, and that gives you your 3 years, right? So that explains the first case of a truncated Orlah count, which is 2 years and 44 days. And now on the other side of the spectrum, V'imnata b'yom tet zayin, u'miyom tet zayin ve'elach, moneh mirosh chodesh tishrei haba, gimel shanim shlemim. But if you plant after that cutoff date from the 16th or 17th of Av and onwards, then even when you get to Rosh Hashanah, you haven't achieved 1 year in Orlah counting because it needs to have taken root. And that process takes at least 44 days to achieve. And so in order for that year to count, it has to be in the ground and rooting for 44 days prior. Okay, so far we have we think that we have outlined what it takes to be counted for the 3 years. However, the goalposts are moved at the end of the count. What do I mean? The Shulchan Aruch writes, "Ula'achar Rosh Chodesh Tishrei shel Shana Revi'it." In the 4th year, after you have cleared the Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, there is still one more hurdle to clear, because we have been measuring the years by Rosh Hashanah le Nitiot. But after those 3 years, the sapling graduates and becomes an ilan, becomes a tree. And so now we need to operate based on the Rosh Hashanah le ilanot, which is not until Tu B'Shvat. So after the 3 years of Orlah are counted as a netiah, the fruit needs to wait until it blossoms following the Tu B'Shvat in order for it to not be considered Orlah. So that's how the goalposts move, so that you would need to get from the 3rd year into the 4th year, you add the 4.5 months between Rosh Chodesh Tishrei and the 15th of Shvat. Okay, so just to put this to application in terms of the Chessis family orchard and source number 15, you can see that I planted 2 apple trees and 1 pear tree in Tammuz of 5778. Okay, that was the summer that we bought the house. And because we planted it before Tu B'Av, by the time we got to Rosh Hashanah, 2 months later, and Rosh Hashanah 5779, year 1 was already complete. And then in 5780, year 2 was complete. And then and then we had to wait for Tu B'Shvat 5781 for year 3 to be complete. And then in Nisan, when the tree flowers and the fruits start to grow, they can be eaten. So this schedule makes a lot of sense in Eretz Yisrael, when fruit trees, excuse me, blossom in early spring, all right, around the Tu B'Shvat time, right? We have the song that we know of Hashkedia Parachat, right? The almond tree blossoms. But if the almond tree blossoms before Tu B'Shvat, then it actually is still would still be considered Orlah, because we measure the fruit based on when it starts to, when it's really the chanata is the time when the flowers fall off and a small bump of a fruit emerges. That's the cutoff for when we look at marking this fruit in terms of which year it belongs to. If that chanata happens before Tu B'Shvat, then it goes to the previous year. If it's after Tu B'Shvat, then it's counted in the following year. So if something blossoms in Nisan, it's and goes through and the flowers fall off and the fruit emerges, then it is clearly after the cutoff, and it would be considered the following year. And so the trees that produce fruit at that time can be eaten because they are post the 3rd year and they are in the 4th year. Okay, so I hope that calculation made sense. Any comments or questions about calculating? Usually, if you time it well, it comes out to about 30 months to get past Orlah. And you might be thinking, what seed would produce fruit from, in 30 months? There are a few, but it's really rare. What's more common is for a sapling to be transplanted and then for it to produce fruit within the first 3 years. But the plant does not need to be fruit producing in order for the Orlah counter to start. So theoretically, if you put an orange seed in the ground and it grows over the first 3 years, and then its first fruit is in year 4, that's not Orlah. But that's very unusual in terms of cultivating fruit trees. Usually, my understanding for most fruit trees is from seed to fruit is usually about 6 to 8 years. Usually there's going to be transplanting before that fruit comes, which is why Orlah would still be in effect. And of course, even after a tree is transplanted, once it's 15 years old, if it's not transplanted with enough earth to survive, then the Orlah count restarts. Okay. Okay. Any clarifications on the Orlah counter? Okay. So if we want to try to work the system, it means we should be doing our planting in the summertime. And I've been told that that's not a bad time to plant, because you want to make sure that at least that there's solid rooting before the winter. So I was told that you can, you don't want to plant right before the winter because then it can freeze and die. So the end of the summer, fall can be a good time to plant. Either spring or fall is a good time for planting fruit trees. Okay, so now that we've wrapped up that first topic of how to count the 3 years of Orlah, we're going to move to talk about how to mark the Orlah so as not to mislead people who might be coming by to take a plum. Okay. So here, the Mishnah in Maaser Sheni, in source number 16, says that Kerem Revai, if something is in its 4th year, remember that in that just because we got to the 4th year, it doesn't mean that we are home free to eat our fruit. You might remember from last week when we saw the psukim of Kodesh Hilulim LaHashem, that the 4th year, the fruit still needs to be brought to Yerushalayim to eat. Now, there is a dispute about nowadays whether Neta Revai, the produce of the 4th year, applies outside of the land of Israel. So I'll just scroll up to show you the dispute. I quoted it in the second source that we saw today, or in Yoreh De'ah, the very bottom here, where the Mechaber says, Di neta revai noheg af b'chutz la'aretz. So the Mechaber says that we do have to bring our fruit grown in Sharon to Yerushalayim, or at least redeem it onto a coin, and then bring that coin to Yerushalayim to eat it. However, the Rav Moshe Israelis, who is the lead decisor for the Ashkenazic world, says that Neta Revai is not customary to observe in Chutz La'aretz, rak bekerem, velo b'sh'ar ilenot, but only with vineyards, with grapes is it customary, but not with fruit trees. Okay, so that's the custom. Once we clear the hurdle of Orlah, in Chutz La'aretz at least, we don't have to worry about Neta Revai. So here we were just saying in the Mishnah here that Kerem Revai, if you do have Kerem Revai, a vineyard that it's in its 4th year, even in Chutz La'aretz, mitzayanin oto bekozuzot adama, then you would need to mark it with clods of earth. So you would put pieces of hardened earth around it, which would be unusual, and people who walk by would know not to take from it because it's in its 4th year. V'shel Orlah b'charasit. And with Orlah, you need to use potter's clay. So what is the difference between kozuzot and charasit? Why is there a need to use different materials to mark it? Anyone have a guess? So the Rambam in the next source explains why there is a difference in the marking between Kerem Revai and Orlah. He says the Shel Orlah b'charasit, you need potter's clay which has already been hardened. Hu hatit hasaruf, it's already been burnt. L'fisha isser ha'orlah yoter chamor me'isser Kerem Revai, because Orlah is something that is a more stringent prohibition than Kerem Revai. L'fi shekerem Revai nitan la'achila, because for Kerem Revai you can eat it, you just can't eat it outside of Yerushalayim. The Orlah asura bahana, whereas Orlah you can't eat it and you can't benefit from it, right? So if someone mistakenly eats Kerem Revai outside Yerushalayim, it's not a good thing, but it's not a horrible thing. If someone eats Orlah, it's a horrible thing. Okay, so that explains the difference between the materials, because kozizot adama, clods of earth, will more easily crumble if there's rain or wind, and they will more easily dissolve. Right? Shema yitparech v'yitpazer, they might spread out, v'yavad, and they'll be lost, right? And then your sign is gone. But potter's clay is hard, and it's more durable, and so it'll last longer. It's a more secure method for signaling that this should not be taken. And I will share a fun anecdote here, which is that Rabbi Safar here at Shas teaches the Mishnah class, and there was one day that he got stuck. I remember what it was. It was when one of his children had an exposure last year, and so he asked me to cover for the Mishnah class. And so I did, and I taught the Mishnah that we just learned about marking Orlah using potter's clay. And I got some pieces of clay, and we did a field trip over to my house, and the kids put the clay around our trees. Even though the Chesses orchard that you saw already cleared the Orlah hurdle, those were the apple and the pear tree. But we planted some plum trees just 2 years ago because our other trees in those spots died. And so those new plum trees, we had the kids put these colored pieces of clay around. So if you come to our house and you see some blue or pink pieces of clay around those trees, you'll remember this Mishnah. Okay, so one other fascinating piece about the system of marking trees as Orlah is something that the Rambam writes here, which is, he makes the point that why do you have to mark these trees at all? Who are you protecting by marking these trees? A thief. Why should you go out of your way to care for the spiritual status of someone who is stealing your stuff? Everybody in your family and all your friends know that you just planted these trees. It's only somebody outside your circuit who is taking without permission. So the Rambam says that this Mishnah is only referring to the Shemitah year. Because during the Shemitah year, everyone's field becomes hefker, becomes ownerless. So even strangers are going to come by and start picking your fruit. And they need the heads up because it's rightfully theirs. If everything is ownerless, then it's fair game for them too. And so the Rambam says in source number 18 that this marking system is, only necessary during a Shemitah year. It's nice to do the other 6 years if you want to remind your neighbors or your children who might forget otherwise not to take from this tree because it's an Orlah tree. But really, you don't need to extend yourself in order to protect people who steal from you. Okay, so fascinating point that the Rambam makes there. Okay. Okay, so here we're going to move to talking about different types of bushes and berries. Because as we mentioned in the first part, that the mitzvah of Orlah applies only to an eitz, to a tree. And the way that we define a tree is in distinction from a vegetable. And there are two criteria that distinguish those two things. The first is that a tree produces fruit annually without having to replant it, whereas a vegetable needs to be replanted every year. The second thing is that the fruit tree produces the fruit from a trunk that remains alive throughout all the seasons, whereas a vegetable will produce its vegetables from the roots and not from the trunk that survives the season. And therefore, we have defining types of we have types of fruit that really, halachically speaking, are considered like vegetables, like a pineapple or a banana, which the trunk dies between the seasons, and so the fruit is really produced not by means of the trunk, but from the roots, and then the trunk that regrows every year. So the same criteria that are used for grouping types of produce into the ha'etz versus the ha'adama category in terms of brachot is the same criteria that's going to be used for distinguishing for Orlah. So I have a chart here which goes, from artichoke through banana and blueberry and blackberry to distinguish in terms of how it grows. So there's a scientific name for it, and also the halachic class and the reason for it, right? So something like an artichoke is a vegetable because it grows back from the root every year, right? Whereas a blueberry is a tree because it's a perennial. The trunk stays alive throughout the entire duration of the year, okay? But then there are some things that are in between, right? So a cranberry is a doubt whether it is considered to be a perennial. It grows, meaning it does grow back every year, but it also grows back from the root. So it is a borderline, and for something that is a borderline, we are going to have to look as to what the mode of operation is for the case of a doubt. Okay, because there is going to be a difference between how we deal with something that is safek orlah, be'eretz Yisrael, and safek orlah b'chutz la'aretz, a case of uncertainty. Okay, so we can scroll through the rest of these. Some of them are pretty obvious that an eggplant is a vegetable. But some of these things are on the border, like a papaya and a passion fruit. Those are all on the border. So do we consider those to be orlah or not? Right, things like strawberries, pineapples, those are clear ha'adama and that don't require the weighting of orlah. So in terms of all of the cases that are in doubt into what their classification is, an eitz or ha'adama, there is a rule of operation in uncertain scenarios that is outlined by the Mishnah in the third parak, the last parak of the Mishnayot of Orlah. Safek Orlah, here I'm in source 20. So a case of doubtful Orlah, Be'eretz Yisrael Asur. If you're talking about the land of Israel, then it's going to be prohibited. We're going to go lechumra. We're going to be stringent in this uncertain scenario. Ubisuria mutar, and in Syria it's mutar. Ubechutz la'aretz, yored velokeach, ubilvad shelo yerenu locate. Right, in chutz la'aretz, you can certainly go and take it, so long as you're he has not seen him gathering it. Okay, so we're gonna look in a moment what this last part of the Mishnah is talking about. But before we get there, just to clarify the three different scenarios here, is when you have an uncertain case of orlah in Israel, you cannot eat it. So like a papaya, for instance, if it's in Israel, the first 3 years, it's considered to be orlah misafek. If it's in Syria, it's mutar, but it's still recommended not to, okay? And the difference there is that that area was considered part of Israel during a certain period of time in history. So that's why there is a doubt about it. But in chutz la'aretz, you can go down and you can take it, meaning we rule leniently that it is going to be permissible in chutz la'aretz. Okay, so a papaya grown in Sharon, Massachusetts would not be required for to observe Orlah, whereas in Israel it would be. Okay, so we saw last week that there's a difference between Orlah in Israel and Orlah in Chutz La'aretz. They're both significant mitzvot, but in Israel it's a mitzvah mid'oraita, a biblical mandate, whereas in Chutz La'aretz it's halacha Moshe Sinai, which some say is also de'oraita, but on a little bit of a lower tier de'oraita. Okay, so that is how we would resolve the situation of a doubtful case of Orlah. And this is also relevant when it comes to the topic of hydroponics, when you're growing fruit outside of soil, or you're growing fruit sort of above ground that's not using the soil of the earth. In all of those cases, it is a doubt as to whether Orlah would apply or not apply, because the pasuk that we saw, which talks about Orlah, says "V'chitavo el haaretz," when you come to the land and you plant in the land, right? Which clearly makes it seem that the soil in the land is a prerequisite. So if you're not planting in the soil, then it's a doubt as to whether Orlah applies. And so in Israel, they are stringent when it comes to Orlah applying to hydroponics. But outside of Israel, we are lenient, because it's another example of a doubtful case being resolved differently due to the slightly different categorization or classification of the mitzvah of Orlah between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. Okay, so now let's go back to that last line in the Mishnah. And here I'm going to correct something that I said last week about whether Orlah applies to non-Jews. So this Mishnah is talking about when you see Orlah in a when you're going to a store or going to an orchard of a non-Jew, and you're not sure whether that piece of fruit that you're about to buy or about to pick is Orlah or not. And because it's a non-Jewish owned orchard or farm stand, you know that they don't care about it. So what are you meant to do? So it's possible that that fruit is Orlah. It's possible that that plant was transplanted 2.5 years ago, and it's continued to bear fruit, and that is prohibited to you. So that's possible, even if it's unlikely, because most of the fruit probably came from trees that are much older than that. So in the case of Safek Orlah in Eretz Yisrael, you cannot partake in it if there's a possibility that it is Orlah. In Syria, you can, even though it's not recommended. But in Chutz La'aretz, you can go down and you can take the piece of fruit, so long as you don't see the non-Jew picking it from the Orlah tree. Okay, so as long as there's no sign which says this tree is 2 years old, and you see the non-Jew picking from that tree and putting it in your basket, you can assume that the fruit is not coming from Orlah, even though it's possible that it is. So we see from the subtext of this Mishnah that an Oved Kochavim, somebody who is not Jewish, the fruit that they grow is subject to Orlah. Now this was a little bit confusing to me to discover, because it seems to go against the way that we categorized Orlah as a mitzvah that is person dependent. If it is really person dependent, which is why it is incumbent upon us even outside of Israel, then it would seem to be that it shouldn't be relevant to non-Jews. So it seems to defy the classification of that we gave it last week, in the sense that it is obligated from not that non-Jews are not obligated in it, but fruit that non-Jews grow is obligated in it, right? So it seems to be going back towards the land and less about the person. So that's just a bit about Orlah for non-Jews. Okay, so just to do a little bit of review, these were some of the key terms and concepts that we covered this evening. The first two, Nitiya, a sapling, and Rosh Hashanah, we already covered. The next one is Shorashim Shtila, which is transferring from a nursery to the ground. A sapling whose roots are encased by a clod of soil enables the tree to live for at least 2 weeks without the addition of any soil, is considered replanted in its place. In this case, it is possible to count the years the sapling grew in the nursery as part of the Orlah count. Okay, so that was something we saw as well. If there's enough earth that's surrounding it to survive for 2 weeks, then you can just resume the count from earlier and you don't have to restart it. Chanata, we saw, is blooming. It's the stage of a fruit's development that determines its relation to Orlah and Netarabai. Blooming is the initial stage in the development of a fruit when the fruit is still small. It's once the flowers have fallen off. We mentioned a little bit about Havarat Shtilim Nimishtala, when you're transferring saplings. And we also talked about the Ilanshin Ekar Hasela Imo, the amount of earth that's required for the transplant to happen and the Orlah count to continue. We mentioned about Safek Orlah and uncertain cases of Orlah, that there's a difference between the land of Israel and outside of Israel. This is a new one, compost, but I thought it was important to mention that you cannot benefit at all from Orlah fruit, and not even for the purpose of compost, even though it's indirect. And so the proper thing to do if you have Orlah fruit is to either burn it or to bury it. But not to use it for any other beneficial purpose, whether it's feeding your animals or contributing to the compost that will eventually be used for the following year. And we spoke a little, yeah, Michelle, go ahead.
Indirect benefit of a fruit tree, you could take that a million directions, right? Like fruit trees attract pollinators and then that benefits your yard. If you just leave the fruit on the ground, and it kind of composts there, it enriches your soil. Where does that end?
Yeah, it's a fair question, and it's really only the sort of typical types of direct benefit that you would have from fruit. So, a pollinator is pretty indirect, and it's really, it might attract bees that would then, pollinate other fruit too. But it is a problem if you're intentionally using that fruit to compost for the sake of another garden, right? But if it falls on the ground and you don't notice it, and it provides some nutrients to that soil, right? That's an unintentional act of benefit. But it's anything that is sort of like an act of eating or an act of feeding it to animals, right? That's an intentional act of benefit. Okay, and then one other piece here is Ta'arovet Orlah. If you know that you have a few Orlah fruit that your kid threw into the bushel with the other ones. So typically when we have a mixture of forbidden and permitted things, the ratio in terms of meat and milk is 1:60, right? That's when we say if something is batel, it's nullified, that's the ratio. But when it comes to Orlah, because Orlah is such a severe and high level commandment, it's only permitted if there are 200 permitted fruits for every forbidden one. Okay, and then finally, this Perot Nochrim of non-Jews, we said it is derived from the phrase kol eitz in the pasuk, which indicates that even if the tree belongs to a non-Jew, Orlah would still apply to the Jew who is eating the fruit from it, even if it's not incumbent upon the owner, him or herself. Okay, so we're going to conclude with one final source, which brings out a little bit more of a redemptive sort of layer to this enterprise of studying the laws connected to the land. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin says, this is in Perek HaChelek, which is talking about a lot of esoteric end of days kinds of topics. And the Gemara there says that Amar Rabbi Abba ein lecha kates megula mizeh, that there is no greater sign that the redemption is on its way than from the following. The pasuk which says, Ve'ata hare Yisrael, the mountains of Israel, anfechem titnu, the branches will, from the hills of Israel, the branches will give forth, uprichem tis'u la'ami Yisrael, and their fruit will be given to my people, the land, my people Israel. So when produce is being grown in abundance in Eretz Yisrael, it is an indication that Mashiach will be coming soon. So I take this source as a bit of a romantic source, in the sense that it is showing the revival of the land when it is producing fruit in such a way that it is bountiful and sustaining for the people of the land and beyond. And so for me, part of the attraction to talking about fruit trees has to do with this midrash, which is coming to life in our times, where the fruit of Israel is plentiful and is providing sweetness to so many. And Orlah is a little bit of a connection that we can have even in Chutz La'aretz to an agriculturally based mitzvah in Israel, because it's incumbent upon us even outside of Israel. So I hope this gives us a little bit of hope as we tend to our Orlah trees, and we are anticipating better days ahead, not just of enjoying the sweetness of the fruits, but also hopefully a world-changing kind of order with the arrival of the redemption. So that's a wrap for me. I'll stop sharing. If anyone has any comments or questions, would be happy to address them.
Thanks. Maybe one question, Rabbi. So you mentioned the concept that if you take a tree that you have in a pot, or you're transplanting it, if it can live for 2 weeks, right, in the soil that it has, then Orlah does not reset. Is there any, trees can look like they're okay for quite some time. It's hard to tell if it's dying. Is there any qualification or way to assess that over a few weeks?
There might be, but the I guess the rabbis said that the amount of time that it takes for a root to really, I guess, set itself into the soil is 14 days. So I'm not sure if there's an outer sort of sign of that. It could be a discoloration of the trunk, which shows, if you sometimes scratch beneath the bark and you see that it's green, you know that the roots are drawing water and nutrients from the soil. If you scratch the bark and it's just brown, it means that the tree is not, which indicates that it's either dead or dying. So I think perhaps it's about 14 days between those two states. That's my that's my understanding.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Sure. Any other thoughts or comments?
I'm looking in the little table of the characterizing what's a vegetable and what's a tree for the purpose of the Orlah. I was a little surprised about its distinction, between characterization of like raspberries and blackberries versus blueberries, because raspberries and blackberries, they don't actually die to the ground. There's little stems, but I know if you look like on the description from Pedco. Seeds, for example, they talk about, oh, the fruit come from second-year canes or first-year canes, but the canes are usually just coming up not directly from the ground, but for something that was already sticking up above the ground. Not that I want them to be Orlah, but I'm wondering to what degree there was detailed sort of a botanical examination of how all these different bushes actually grow, which, you know, obviously can be a lot of complexity. It's not simply some have a stem that live from year to year and some die and the rest just die back. There are a lot that sort of in between.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a great answer. I consulted with Rabbi Moshe Bloom, who runs an agricultural like think tank in Israel, and is trying to write and publish more of this material to the general Israeli public. And he provided this list to me. But I don't know his qualifications with regard to botany, how this list was vetted. And I also noticed that that at least empirically, blueberries and raspberries and blackberries don't seem to be so different in terms of their bush formation. But I guess from this difference, that it's indicating that blueberries, that the trunk of the blueberry tree stays alive during the off season, whereas the raspberry bush, it's just the shell of the trunk and not the inside.
That's not my experience when I prune them. Where you see I prune them, it says prune them about knee high, and and basically you can see that there's, well, at least when I prune them, there's living tissue, and then from those stems, not from the ground itself, but from above the ground, you have the new what they call canes sprouting out. And then it's from the new ones that you get the fruit, but they don't originate from the ground. They originate from the prior year's pruned canes. But also kiwis grow on a vine. So how would you consider a kiwi?
Yeah,
Since
so
there are hardy kiwis that grow in this climate, I just found out.
Cool. I mean, my presumption is that vines are not obligated in Orlah, because they really don't have live tissue during the off season. That's my understanding. But what I'm unsure about is like which part of the trunk needs to be alive, in order for it to be considered to be a tree in the off season. Because even with a pineapple or a banana, right, there is still some part of it, not the majority of it, but some part of it that stays alive. So I don't know what that cutoff is, but I think that's sort of where the key to this lies.
And also is dormant alive, because you'll never, you can't have a situation where if a part of the plant actually died, you can never have growth from that part of the plant again.
Right.
Whereas if it's dormant, obviously that's very different.
Yeah. Okay, any other comments? Okay, well, thank you all for participating and joining. It was a pleasure to prepare and teach and learn together. Laila Tov.
Thank you, Abba.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.